We're now going to hear from our expert panel about cities and growth. And if I could ask them to come to the stage, please. And while they're doing that, our moderator for this evening of tonight's panel is...
Welcome again to what I hope will be a conversation this evening about some of the challenges that we face in cities and challenges we hope we can alleviate currently and perhaps avoid in the future. I'd like to firstly introduce you to the panel that we have here tonight. Here on my immediate left here is Kirsty, who has for the past 5 years been the CEO of the Planning Institute of Australia and is also on the board of directors of the Australasian Society of the Association of Executives. Next to her, Docherty, who comes to us from South Australia. For the past 6 years, the Mayor of the city of Playford on Adelaide's outer fringes. Is that a fair description? Indeed, northern suburbs. Next to Glenn is Jago Dodson, who's the Professor of Urban Policy and the Director of the Centre for Urban Research at RMIT University in Victoria. And beside him is Sharon Noyle, who's the residents' representative. She is a resident of the suburb of Doreen in Melbourne's north, with a long interest in planning issues in her area, and she commutes to the city. So I would like to begin our conversation tonight with Sharon and ask perhaps, can we hear from you, Sharon, on your experience? What are the challenges for you? Tell us about your commute time and the challenges for you in the day-to-day between home and work.
Thank you. Okay, so I work in Doreen. It's about 35 to 40 kilometres from Melbourne CBD. I currently travel to work. I leave at 7 o'clock in the morning to get down to work for hopefully 8:45. Sometimes it can take anything up to 2.5 hours on a normal day to get home from work, and depending on the traffic going, it can be just as congested going. I have 3 children. I have one at primary school, high school, and one out at work. My middle one is at high school. He catches the bus at 7:30 in the morning in order to get to school on time, hopefully for around 8:40 in the morning, in order for the buses to get to the school through the traffic. And occasionally he is late, but most of the time he can get there on time. So my main issues that I deal with are my travel, my commute to the city. I do drive. I have considered public transport. Public transport is going to take me a minimum hour and a half, and that will involve driving to the station, after I've caught the train, catching a bus or a tram, and then a walk in order to get to work. So in the winter, it's not a particularly pleasant journey. In the summer, it's not a particularly pleasant journey because it's a little bit warm. And obviously, there are lots of other elements that can interrupt that journey.
Sharon, what would you say if I said to you, why not get a job closer to home? What are the prospects for you for getting work closer to where you live or living closer to where you work?
Yep. So about 5 years ago, I was living a little bit nearer. I was working in Richmond, which was only about 35 kilometres. That started off with an hour trip when I originally started. It was turned into a 2-hour journey within 3 years. So I was made redundant and I decided I'd actually take a life change and I'd work closer to home. I applied for a large number of jobs locally. I was overqualified. I was agreeing to take a pay cut, but the employers felt that I would get bored, that they couldn't utilise my services properly, and therefore that I would then move to something that was better pay or that had more prospects.
And what field are you working in, Sharon?
I work in fleet management and Toyota finance particularly, so with vehicles and novated vehicles, so I work a lot on the phone with drivers. So it's the drivers that own their vehicles that take the tax benefits and the fringe benefit tax accordingly for their vehicles.
And given that you do work now so far from where you live, what do you do if there's a problem with the kids at school or something during the day where a parent is required?
Okay, we started off when the children were small with after-school care. That's very expensive. That was, especially during the school holidays, it was about $110 a day for the childcare. It's about $50 a day for the two of them to do morning and afternoon. Plus also there were extra expenses when they were doing activities, or if I was late, then they would charge a lot more money for being late. So we actually now have an au pair. So an au pair lives with us. She comes from Germany. She lives with us for 6 months. She has the use of a car so that she can help transport the children to their activities, and also that she can be on board to pick them up at a moment's notice when there's a call from the school, because
Thanks.
it's too far to come otherwise.
Glenn, what's the situation in the city of Playford? As I understand it, you're talking about trying to create a second CBD for Adelaide around the town of Elizabeth. Tell us about that, and tell us what your biggest challenges are in your area.
Thanks, Karen. Well, I'll talk a little bit about Playford and then my role as the chair of the National Growth Areas Alliance and what communities around Australia are telling us. But in relation to Playford, the border closest to the CBD is about 23 kilometres. And we've got some great opportunities with the growth that's occurring in our population in north of Adelaide to make Elizabeth the second CBD. What we are seeing is state government planning decisions to zone land further and further out. And we've got great opportunities in the heart of the Elizabeth district with 50 hectares of land next to the second busiest railway station that today has sheep next to it. But we've got government planning decisions where we'll zone further and further out. It's just crazy. How do we get that better density and better opportunity to maximise the investment that state and federal government have put in infrastructure? Because what we're seeing is further congested roads, railway stations further out from the main centre of Elizabeth, getting crowded, not enough car parks, and people having to drive 15 or 20 minutes extra to another station to get on a train to then go to work in Adelaide. But the broader concern that people across fast-growing suburbs across Australia are telling us is the congested roads, the poor and inadequate public transport, where they spend more time in the backseat of their car than playing with their kids in their backyard. And it's not just getting onto the freeway or catching the train into a city of Sydney, for example. It's also traversing across your suburb. And we need to maximise in our policy shift of the infrastructure we need to actually get on to the big infrastructure projects that government have spent. Otherwise, they're not maximising their full potential.
Is that a design problem or an upkeep problem with the roads?
I think it's a bit of both. I think it's a design problem and then the acute maintenance of how you actually manage that. But the fundamental question for many of our fast-growing suburbs, and the reason why we're calling for a dedicated infrastructure fund, is that many people commute and have to travel because there isn't jobs close to home. There isn't an opportunity to be the 30-minute city in the fast-growing outer suburbs that are growing with immigration and population growth and housing affordability where people are setting up their families. And this is the issue. We need the good infrastructure locally so we can traverse our communities, but making sure and having jobs close to home builds in that 30-minute city environment. Because at the moment, to get close to work, to get the kids to soccer and get the kids into what you need, it is a 90-minute city for many of our communities on the fringe.
Thanks. Kirsty, we seem to have twin challenges then. We have the challenge of addressing the problems that exist in cities as they are now, already built, and then the challenge of planning ahead for these new areas that we've just heard about. Can you tell us a little bit about the report we heard about earlier? What are the megatrends that you're finding? What's the priority that needs addressing in terms of these new areas of growth? Is it, I mean, population growth is huge, so is it transport? Is it access to the local shops? Is it schools? What's the planning challenge there?
Yeah, well, I mean, we really are playing catch up. So in listening to Sharon's story, and we were chatting about it before, we've got some big issues in our cities, and not just in our cities, but in our regional cities as well, not just the capital ones. But one of the challenges with that playing catch-up is that we're looking at the population growth that this country is experiencing and is likely to experience into the future, which is where, when we put together the journey towards Australia at 50 million, looking at, where we will reach that at some point unless there's some intervention. And it's also around, well, what's our policy or a strategy around where those people go? Where are we directing that growth so that the infrastructure and other spending that we're making now is in the right locations to support that growth? Otherwise, we'll continue to be playing that catch-up. So, transport is a pretty significant one for people. How that aligns with land use planning decisions, and I think that's one of the biggest disconnects that we have out there, is that integration between infrastructure decision making and land use planning is something that we really have to address. That comes down to a lack of integration across government agencies, and so that vertical integration between federal, state and local government decisions, but also horizontally between government agencies at each of those levels as well.
Jago, we've seen a little bit lately about policy proposals in relation to cities and planning. From what you've seen on the eve of an election, no pressure, what do you make of the proposals that we've seen thus far about infrastructure investment? We've seen the federal government talking about direct federal investment. The opposition has a slightly different policy, and the Greens have a separate policy again. What's your view on the policy proposals and where they are good and where they might need work?
Look, I think the policy that was announced last week, the Smart Cities policy, has two major elements. One is the notion of city deals, which are really about infrastructure financing, from what I can make of them, and adding an element of coordination around how infrastructure is financed and finding new ways of bringing additional infrastructure into the mix. Additional financing into the infrastructure mix, so we can build more infrastructure with the existing kind of pool of government money. Now that's absolutely necessary, I think, and the more innovation we can bring into the financing without putting too many hooks and pratfalls into the way the arrangements are structured that kind of add additional costs, say, down the track for government, is really important. The other side of it is the discussion around the development of suburban clusters and employment and the 30-minute city notion and expanding that. I think that's a really important area to push forward on. As we've heard in some of the conversation already tonight, we are a suburban nation, essentially, yet the distribution of employment and services across our suburbs is highly uneven. And so that notion of encouraging employment clusters and wider distribution of services within our suburbs, I think, is something really important that is good to see coming out of policy. We saw elements of that in the previous government's efforts in urban policy around suburban manufacturing precincts and suburban jobs, and I think we're seeing a version of that appearing in the current government's policy perspective. And it's really encouraging that we're starting to see almost a bipartisan or tripartisan recognition that addressing those deficits in suburbia is going to be a really key part of urban policy. We can do the shiny sort of big picture stuff like metros and tunnels and that sort of thing in the inner cities, but resolving some of the challenges in the suburbs is absolutely critical to urban policy.
Without wanting to skip into a field of landmines, what role does housing affordability play in all of these planning issues, do you think?
Housing affordability is a very complex area, and many of the challenges... And
Nicely done, by the way.
Many of the issues we've heard of in terms of long commuting is partly driven by people's search for more affordable housing, especially those who want to access home ownership. And there's been a lot of research done that shows that people are kind of forced to move further out by housing markets and then suffer much higher rates of car dependence as a consequence of their desire for that, I think, legitimate desire for home ownership. So finding ways to unlock both housing supply, and I don't just mean reducing planning processes, but actually finding ways to improve the opportunity for developing housing. Plus, I think we've also had the debate about housing, how finance flows into housing and how funds from different sources and wealth flow into housing in recent weeks, and I don't think as a country we've quite resolved that question yet. If we look back to some of the post-war period when the home ownership rate went from 50% to 70% in the space of 20 years, that didn't occur just by letting things unfold as they did. That occurred through Commonwealth intervention into the housing system to coordinate at large scale, large streams of funding through the states and in collaboration with the states, some into social housing, but a large proportion of it ended up through mortgage financing into home ownership housing. Probably the greatest expansion of public welfare in Australia's history was that period after the Second World War when we lifted our home ownership rate by 20 percentage points. That kind of thinking
Yep.
is probably where we need to start heading to with our housing affordability, and it comes down to very big picture questions which we've seen unfold in the newspapers over the last, and between the parties over the last couple of weeks, about who owns housing wealth and
Yep.
who doesn't, and how we distribute that across society.
I'd like to come back to the funding question, but I wanted to ask Sharon, you're living where you live because you like it and that's where you prefer to live, and the problem you talked about with employment is obviously not immediately solvable. You can't whistle up a job that suits you in your area. For you, what's the most immediate thing that needs addressing? I mean, for example, if you happen to find yourself in a room full of politicians, hypothetically, I don't know when that would happen, but if you did, what would you say to them about your number one priority? What would help you in the situation you're in now?
I think based on what we currently have, the attention probably needs to be directed to the roads that connect us to the other cities, the roads that connect us to our rail system, to our schools, to the other facilities that are out there, because we don't have them yet. So the bigger we get as a town, the more we are using facilities in other towns as our children are growing and developing new ideas and new plans and new things that they want to do. We have to go further and further afield in order to accommodate these. So it's the link from us to the towns nearby. The immediate links are the bigger ones. The roads that we use that link us directly to our nearest towns haven't changed since the growth started.
So are these new roads that you need, or better, wider roads that you have already?
I think improving the roads we currently have, where possible making them wider. Sometimes it can be just something as simple as putting in proper drainage and guttering so the roads don't flood every time we have heavy rains, that the cars don't go off the road and end up in ditches when the kangaroos come out for us. Just those little things that actually block an entire road. We had a bus, somebody had amended their driveway, a bus came out, dropped down a hole and blocked the road for 3 hours.
And that was the only way?
And that was the only road and the only way. And the traffic was just so bad, nobody could actually go anywhere else because everything was just clogged and the kids were 3 hours late for school.
Thank you. Kirsty, we often see a buck passing between the levels of government, our three famous levels of government in Australia. Who should take ultimate responsibility for planning for these things in your view? Do you have a view on whose ultimate responsibility it is? Is it the local government? Is it state government coordinating? Or should the federal government oversee the whole thing?
Nice one. Thanks for that.
I'm a
Had that
journalist.
champagne before. No, look, I think there are different levels of responsibility for different decisions. I mean, one of the things, though, is ultimately all the people involved in this have a responsibility to solve the problem, and that includes all of the professionals and the industry groups here as well. We have a big issue to solve. One of the challenges that we've got out there is, you know, we're talking about where people live and what sort of environments they're living within, and whether, you know, one of the big challenges that we have in most of our communities and cities is around density and the backlash to that. Well, we need to do it better. And so one of the things I think we need to be looking at when we're talking with the federal government, state and local government is how we demonstrate how you can do density better, how we can create the sorts of communities that people want to live in, that they can access those services so that they don't need to make lifestyle decisions to move out to the fringe, only to find that they can't access the services that they need. I mean, in our cities and in our inner cities, we have all of those things there, but the environment that people are living with is often quite challenging in terms of the quality of design, the density issues, even just the poor housing that is often being developed. So I think that's a responsibility for all of us. You know, we're coming into a federal election. I think the federal government does have a responsibility to play there, and also in terms of that collaboration between federal government, state government and down to local government and across industry as well, to help deliver that better. I think we can't just leave it to the states and territories to deal with, or for local government to deal with it. So a joint responsibility.
Glenn, you mentioned the report, and it was remiss of me to not mention the National Growth Areas Alliance report commissioned by the Alliance from PwC recently that talks about a central fund. But that report also talks about greater coordination between the levels of government, and we just heard Kirsty talking about that. I'm wondering, again, call me cynical, but I have seen the odd conflict between levels of government and also the odd bit of partisanship in relation to planning on transport and infrastructure. How realistic do you think it is that we can get 3 levels of government working together and different political parties working together, not scoring political points, but trying to achieve something that is actually quite long-term?
Well, our research from our community has shown us, and what our community is telling us, that they just have to stop the lucky dip process of projects in the outer suburbs or in the inner city areas of Australia in building the infrastructure that they need.
In marginal seats?
Well, some of our areas are marginal seats, but our community tells us that it's lucky dip, and election cycles are playing the role. We need to have something longer, because when they purchase a house and set up their family, they're there for 10, 15 years.
Right.
So they're telling us that we need to have a dedicated solution. I think a great start of the conversation is actually having a federal government that puts out the smart cities concept. We have an opposition that has been for many years talking about the role and need of a federal government in cities. We've got the Greens who have been advocating for a long period of time as well. So I think we are on the way to having a decent, open debate in this country from all levels of government, because we have buy-in now from the 3 levels of government. It's beholden on us to actually work together to come up with the solutions to everyday problems. Because when I sit and listen to Sharon, these are the things that are affecting 5 million Australians every day. It's a travesty that the most urbanised country in the world, that when the bus gets stuck in a pothole, that no one can get to work in outer Melbourne for 3 hours because we haven't thought and planned and worked together to be productive, which is just not right. So for a fair and more equitable society, and particularly in our growth areas, where the population is growing at double the rate of national average, we need to have these mechanisms, and that's why our PwC report has outlined some of the ways it could be done. And it's about organisations such as the NGAA and the others in this room, not just asking for a handout and sniping on the sideline, but actually working with the 3 levels of government to try to come to effective solutions. Because every day that we waste, and we haven't got a day to waste, we have the very issues that Sharon and constituents right around the country face in being productive, healthy, happy. And if we want to be an innovative nation and reach our full potential, we've got no choice but to work together.
Jago, how do you think these things should be funded? I mean, there's one question about who should coordinate, then there's another question about who should pay for it. Here in Parliament House, we've heard a lot said in the last couple of weeks about the idea of value capture, of ensuring that the private sector has a role in funding infrastructure in collaboration with governments. Do you have a view on the idea of that and how that is best done? Is it some kind of a rates hike or a levy? Or, and should it be restricted to new development, existing development? What's your view about the best way to properly fund planning and infrastructure?
Well, look, on specifically the question of value capture, I think it's a really important mechanism that we can start to use to retain for public purposes the benefit from public infrastructure investment that accrues to private interests, in a sense, and that if someone builds a train station near your house, you benefit from that that development. At the current in the current policy, we don't really capture that value back from you as a homeowner who's got a windfall gain. So that's a really important policy. And if you actually look at how, say, Melbourne's Metropolitan Rail Network was funded, it was essentially funded on that basis, in the sense that speculators essentially built the rail infrastructure and then paid for it through the land sales that occurred around the station. So it's not a dramatically new model for Australia. We've seen it happen here in the past, and we've just forgotten about it. And I think it's important that we revisit that and find out what model would work in the contemporary environment. In terms of broader financing, that's a very complex question. I'm of the view that we need to generate new revenue streams within our cities, so that the gains from improved economic performance in cities, however they are manifest, whether it's through increased consumption such as the GST, or through increased property values, through land values, but some of that gain, much of which comes about as a consequence of the investment of public infrastructure that has occurred not just now but historically, that some of that gain is captured back for public purposes. And I think broad-based land taxes have been raised in this recent debate about cities that's come up, and there's I think a fair degree of consensus amongst sort of academics and economists that is a really important mechanism that could be used for generating a new source of revenue that can be ploughed into infrastructure in our cities. There's another dimension to this, though, that I'd like to just raise, which is that we often focus on infrastructure as a solution to our problems, and that's not always going to be the best way of approaching things. We've heard a lot of this conversation about the governance issues that are actually blocking improvements to the way our cities work, and there are many aspects of the way we actually operate our current infrastructure that either is inefficient or underutilises it. There's been a successive series of reports, including starting with the first ever Infrastructure Australia report back in 2008, saying we need to optimise the existing infrastructure rather than build new infrastructure as a priority. In the public transport area, we've seen a Senate inquiry say exactly the same thing. We've seen in Victoria various Auditor General reports say the same thing, that we're actually not using our existing infrastructure particularly efficiently. If you look at our roads, we clog them every day with single occupant motor vehicles. Now that's
I may be guilty of that myself occasionally.
Now that's if you look at the value of the existing value of the asset of our road network, in each of our capital cities, say Melbourne or Sydney, it's probably worth hundreds and hundreds of billions of dollars in terms of its value. Yet we use it incredibly inefficiently by putting individual drivers and individual cars on that road network. Now, given the cost of new road construction is increasing, we've seen the East-West link was going to cost around $10 billion to build in Victoria for a very small stretch of road. That's a very costly way of delivering the kind of service outcomes that we're trying to get in terms of mobility in our cities. We should be looking at using our existing assets more efficiently. In the public transport space, successive reports, including the Senate report, various academic reports, Auditor General reports have said we're not actually planning and coordinating our public transport networks efficiently at all to optimise how they operate. Before we start investing in metros and a new kind of major public transport infrastructure, we should be looking where the gains are that don't require a great deal of infrastructure investment, but just a little bit of clever thinking and a little bit of coordination and possibly some governance improvements.
Thank you. That might be where we leave it, with a little bit of clever thinking, a challenge for those of us who are here to address the existing infrastructure problems and plan well for the future, for the long term in what is often a short-term political environment. I wish you all very well with that challenge. I thank you for your attention, and please join me in thanking our panel this evening.